The auction house smelled of sweat and desperation, a converted barn on the outskirts of a town that had long since forgotten its name mattered. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of afternoon light that pierced through gaps in the weathered wood, and the air hung heavy with the weight of human misery. This was the kind of place that existed in the margins of society, where the law turned a blind eye and morality was a luxury no one could afford. On the platform stood three young women, their bellies swollen with life, their eyes downcast in shame and fear. They were Chinese, barely into their 20s, and they clutched each other's hands like drowning women grasping at driftwood. Their names were May, Lin, and Hua, though no one in the crowd bothered to learn them. To the assembled buyers, they were merely merchandise, and damaged merchandise at that. The auctioneer, a pot-bellied man with tobacco-stained teeth, wiped his forehead with a dirty handkerchief and surveyed the sparse crowd with poorly concealed disappointment. He'd been in this business for 20 years, and he knew a difficult sale when he saw one. Now then, gentlemen, we have here 3 healthy young women, strong backs, good for field work or domestic service. He began, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of his trade. They're expecting, as you can see, but that'll pass soon enough, and then you'll have workers who know what's what, if you catch my meaning. A few men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Others laughed ugly sounds that made the 3 women flinch, but most simply turned away, heading for the exit. Pregnant women meant complications, medical expenses, time lost to childbirth and recovery. In this economy, in this market, they were worthless. Come now, starting bid of $200 for all 3. The auctioneer called, desperation creeping into his voice. That's less than $70 apiece. Where are you going to find labor that cheap? Silence answered him. The crowd had thinned to perhaps a dozen men, and they were studying their boots or checking their watches, waiting for the next lot. $100 then, the auctioneer said, his face reddening. $100 for 3 workers. That's robbery, that is, but I'm feeling generous today. Still nothing. May's grip on Lin's hand tightened until her knuckles went white. She could feel Lin trembling beside her, could hear Hugh, as quiet sobs on her other side. They all knew what happened to merchandise that didn't sell. They'd be moved to a worse place, sold to worse men, or simply disposed of like the refuse the buyers apparently thought they were. At the back of the barn, leaning against a support post that had probably been there since before the Civil War, stood a man who hadn't moved throughout the entire auction. He was tall, maybe 6'3", with shoulders that spoke of a lifetime of hard work and hands that looked like they'd been carved from oak. His face was weathered, lined with the kind of deep creases that come from years of squinting into the sun and wind. He might have been 40 or 60, it was hard to tell. What was easy to see was the sadness in his eyes, a bone, deep sorrow that seemed to permeate his entire being. His name was Jacob Thornton, and he owned a cattle ranch 3 hours north, up in the high country where the air was thin and the winters were brutal. He'd come to this God-forsaken place not because he wanted to, but because his ranch hands had quit on him one by one, driven away by his grief and his silence, until he was left alone on 8,000 acres with 3,000 head of cattle, and no one to help him work them. He'd buried his wife Sarah 2 years ago, buried her and the child she'd been carrying, a son they were going to name Michael. The doctors said it was an aneurysm, sudden and painless, though Jacob doubted any death was truly painless. He'd found her in the kitchen, collapsed on the floor with her hand still holding the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the soup. The soup had burned. He still couldn't stand the smell of burned food. Since then, he'd been hollowed out, going through the motions of living without any real desire to continue. The ranch needed workers, so he'd come here, to this moral cesspool, because he was too tired to care about the ethics of it anymore. He just needed help, and this was where desperate men found desperate solutions. But as he watched those 3 terrified women on the platform, something stirred in the dead place where his heart used to be. He saw the way they held each other, the fierce protectiveness in their postures despite their fear. He saw their pregnant bellies and thought of Sarah, thought of all the preparations they'd made for Michael, the crib he'd built with his own hands, the tiny clothes Sarah had sewn during the long winter evenings. $50. The auctioneer was saying now, his voice tinged with humiliation. $50 for all 3, and I'll throw in transportation to wherever you need them. Final offer before I send them back. Back meant death, probably. Or something worse than death. Jacob had heard the stories. He pushed off from the post and walked forward, his boots echoing on the rough wooden floor. Every man in the barn turned to look at him. The auctioneer's face lit up with desperate hope. "I'll give you 500, Jacob said, his voice rough from disuse. He hadn't spoken to another human being in weeks. The auctioneer's mouth fell open. 500, sir, the asking price is only 500, Jacob repeated firmly. But there are conditions. Name them, the auctioneer said quickly, before this miracle could evaporate. I want papers showing these women are free to leave my employment whenever they choose. I want documentation showing they're paid workers, not slaves or indentured servants. And I want medical certificates showing they're healthy and fit to travel. The auctioneer blinked rapidly, clearly confused by this turn of events. In his world, buyers tried to haggle down, not up. They sought ways to bind workers more tightly, not set them free. That's highly irregular, sir. The whole point of $500, Jacob interrupted, pulling a worn leather wallet from his jacket pocket. Cash money, right now, or I walk, and you're stuck with merchandise nobody wants. The calculation played across the auctioneer's face like a telegraph message. $500 was more than he'd make in a month. The 3 women were clearly unsellable to anyone else. And if this fool wanted to pay premium price for what he could have had for $50, well, that was his business. Done, the auctioneer said, snapping his fingers at a nervous-looking clerk who'd been standing to one side. Draw up the papers like the gentleman specified. 20 minutes later, Jacob walked out of that barn with 3 terrified women trailing behind him like lost sheep. He'd paid extra for a doctor to examine them on the spot, a young physician who seemed nearly as uncomfortable with the situation as the women themselves. The doctor had pronounced them all healthy, about 5 or 6 months along, he estimated, though he couldn't be sure without more thorough examinations. Jacob's truck was a battered Ford that had seen better decades, but the engine ran true and the cab was clean. He'd put fresh blankets on the bench seat that morning, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe some part of him had known what he was going to do, even before his conscious mind had accepted it. "You can sit in the cab," he said to the women, his voice gentler than it had been in the barn. "It'll be a long drive." They stared at him with wide, frightened eyes, not moving. They didn't speak English, he realized. Or maybe they did and were too terrified to try. He gestured to the truck, miming sitting down, and after a moment of whispered consultation in Chinese, they climbed in, cramming themselves onto the bench seat meant for 2 people, maybe 3, if they were friendly. Jacob got behind the wheel and started the engine. As the barn disappeared in his rearview mirror, he saw all 3 women turn to look back at it, their expressions unreadable. Freedom, he'd learned, didn't always feel like freedom when you had nowhere to go and no one waiting for you. The drive north took 4 hours, and Jacob didn't try to make conversation. What would he say? he'd bought them, even if he'd bought them with the intention of setting them free. He'd walked into that barn planning to purchase human beings, and no amount of liberal paperwork changed that fundamental fact. The weight of it sat heavy on his shoulders, another sin to add to the collection that kept him awake at night. The women didn't speak either, not to him and barely to each other. They sat rigid, tense, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to reveal itself as another cruelty. Jacob understood. He'd stopped believing in kindness himself. The ranch appeared gradually as they climbed into the high country, the grasslands giving way to rolling hills dotted with cattle. The house came into view as they crested the final ridge, a two-story structure built from timber and stone, solid and weathered and desperately in need of a woman's touch. The windows were dark, the porch was cluttered with tools and tack that should have been stored in the barn, and the whole place had the air of abandonment despite Jacob's presence. He parked in front of the house and sat for a moment, his hands still on the wheel. Now what? He'd rescued them, or thought he had, but what came next? He couldn't send them away, not like this, not pregnant and alone in a country that wasn't theirs. But he couldn't keep them either, not really. The papers said they were free to go, and he meant that, but where would they go? Come on, he said finally, opening his door. Let's get you inside. The house was cleaner than he'd expected, which wasn't saying much. He'd been eating meals standing up at the kitchen counter and sleeping on the couch most nights, unable to face the bed he'd shared with Sarah. But the guest bedrooms upstairs were still made up, still had clean sheets from when Sarah had prepared them for visitors who never came. He led the women upstairs, showing them to 3 adjoining bedrooms that shared a bathroom. They followed him silently, eyes darting around, taking in everything, calculating escape routes probably. You can stay here, he said, knowing they might not understand but needing to say it anyway. It's safe. I won't hurt you. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. May, the tallest of the 3, and apparently their spokesperson, said something in Chinese. Her voice was soft but firm, and she gestured at herself and her companions, then at Jacob, her expression questioning. He shook his head. I don't understand. I'm sorry. She tried again, slower this time, and he caught the word why, buried in the Chinese syllables. Why had he bought them? Why had he paid so much? Why had he set them free? Valid questions, all of them. My wife, he said, placing a hand over his heart, my wife died. She was pregnant, like you. He gestured to their bellies, hoping the meaning was clear. I couldn't let them send you back. Something shifted in May's expression, a softening around the eyes. She spoke rapidly to the other 2 women, and they nodded slowly, their shoulders dropping slightly as some of the tension left them. Safe? May asked in heavily accented English. Safe, Jacob confirmed. I promise. That night, Jacob lay awake on the couch, listening to the old house settle around him. Upstairs, he could hear the women moving around, talking in low voices. He wondered what they were saying, what they thought of him, whether they believed his promise of safety, or were simply biding their time until they could escape. He thought about Sarah, about the plans they'd made, the future they'd dreamed of. She'd wanted a big family, 4 or 5 children running wild on the ranch, learning to ride horses and tend cattle and live close to the land. Instead, she'd died trying to give him just 1 child, and he'd been alone ever since. But he wasn't alone now, was he? He had 3 terrified women upstairs, 3 lives depending on him, and the weight of that responsibility was crushing and terrifying and strangely redemptive all at once. The next morning, Jacob woke to the smell of cooking. He sat up, confused, wondering if he was dreaming. But no, that was definitely food, something savory and rich that made his stomach growl. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a proper meal. He walked into the kitchen to find all three women working with the efficiency of a choreographed dance. May was at the stove, cooking something in his largest pan. Lynn was slicing vegetables with one of his good knives, her movements precise and practiced. Hua was setting the table, laying out plates and forks, and in the center of the table was a pot of tea steaming gently. They looked up when he entered, and for a moment everyone froze. Then May smiled, a tentative expression that didn't quite reach her eyes, and gestured to a chair. "Eat," she said, one of the few English words she seemed to know. Jacob sat. They served him rice with vegetables and eggs, simple food prepared with skill, and it was the best thing he'd tasted in 2 years. He ate in silence while they watched him, and when he finished, he looked up to find all three of them studying his face. "Thank you," he said. "That was delicious." May nodded. She pointed to the kitchen, then to herself and the others, then made a sweeping gesture that seemed to encompass the whole house. "You want to help?" Jacob asked. "You want to work?" "Work," May agreed, latching onto the word. "We work. You safe, fair." It wasn't a question exactly. It was a negotiation. They understood they couldn't simply take without giving, not in this world. But they were setting the terms, defining the relationship on their own terms. Jacob felt a surge of respect for them. "Fair," he agreed, "but not too much. You need to rest. The babies." He gestured to their bellies, and all three women's hands moved instinctively to their stomachs, protective and tender. "Small work," May said, "we strong." And so began the strangest arrangement Jacob had ever been part of. The women took over the house.